In this video, we're talking about standard 4.nf.2, comparing fractions. And in this, there's multiple ways that students can learn to compare fractions, and we're going to try to at least briefly hit on each of those. The major way, of course, that we remember that we were taught when we were in elementary school, of course, is by finding common denominator. And so that is the one thing that I really want students to be able to do, is a skill to find a common denominator. Even though there are easier ways to compare fractions, I really want them to have that skill. That just seems important to me. It's just a piece of life that I want them to carry through when they go into middle and high school. Okay, so I am going to first do it with creating a common denominator, and I'm just going to give you an example of a problem. And let's just compare. Let's compare 2/5. Let's compare that, put a little circle in the middle, to 1/3. Okay, so you're looking at those two. You got 5 equal parts here, and you got 3 equal parts, so which is greater? And one thing I want students to think about, we talk about benchmark fractions, and benchmark fractions are those biggies you would see on a number line. 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, 2/3, 3/4. It's those fractions that you want them to think about, especially 1/2. Is the fraction greater than a half, less than a half, just to get a general idea of what it is. But when you have these odd denominators, such as 3 and 5, it's hard for students to visualize, well, okay, it's to be equivalent to 1/2, this would have to be 2.5 fifths. And that's, we're not going to mix decimals and fractions together. But if they think about this, well, if they know that 2.5 is half of 5, they're going to know that 2 is less than 2.5, so this has to be a little bit less than 1/2. And as far as thirds go, 1.5 would be the same as 1/2 of 3, and so 1 is slightly less than 1.5. So again, this would have to be a little less than a half as well. So it's like, this is a toss-up. We got to find a common denominator for us to be able to see which of these fractions is greater. Okay, so we're looking for a common denominator. One thing we talk about that students can do is they can multiply the two denominators together and make that their common denominator, or they can do the least common multiple of the two. And LCM, which stands for least common multiple, that's the one thing that I always tell students that they should get used to doing. Erase that. Okay, so we're doing least common multiple. We want to list out some multiples of each denominator. So if I'm going to do multiples of 5 and multiples of 3, we're going to find the least multiple those two have in common. Okay, so multiples of 5, 10, 15, 20, and we can stop there. And multiples of 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. And we can see, we found our least common multiple, the smallest multiple those two have in common is 15, which would have given us the same as if we just multiplied those two together. So now we know that we can make both of these equivalent to 15ths. So if I want to make this one equivalent to 15ths, I'm just going to squeeze it in here on the side. And I tell students, what do you do to 5 to make 15? We'd have to multiply that by 3. 5 times 3 is 15. So whatever we do to the denominator, we have to do to the numerator. Always have to keep those fractions equivalent when you're doing comparing fractions and creating common denominators. So 2 times 3 is 6. So I know that this fraction, 2/5, is the same as 6/15. I'm going to make this one also equivalent to 15ths, since that is their least common multiple. And how do I go from thirds to 15ths? That would be times 5. I'm going to do the same to the numerator. Times 5, always must do the same. And 1 times 5 is 5. So 1/3 is equivalent to 5/15. So I can see on this side, 2/5 is the same as 6/15. 1/3 is the same as 5/15. So I can see that 6/15 is greater than 5/15. Therefore, 2/5 is greater than 1/3. So that's an example of using least common multiple of the two denominators to find which fraction is greater. Okay, so, and also always thinking about that benchmark fraction is another thing. So if you want to think about, if you put those two, you could also draw number lines, for example. Let's do a quick number line example here. if I were going to do a number line for those two fractions, again, let me just jot those at the top. That was 2/5 and 1/3 we were comparing. So I could draw a number line. And again, just like when we were doing visual fraction models, when we do number lines, we want to make sure we make those the same length. I'm going to draw a number line for fifths, and I'm also going to draw a number line for thirds. And I always tell students we start all of our number lines with 0 because we're not going to go to negative numbers in 4th grade. And let's end these with 1 because we're not making mixed numbers to go beyond 1. Okay, so this first number line, I'm going to denote 2/5. So I'm going to break it into 5 equal parts. So let's say this will be 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, 4/5, and 1 whole, which is 5/5. And I'm going to make this number line into thirds. So here is 1/3, here's 2/3. So if I want to shade each of these, let's shade them. Okay, I'm going to shade, since this one's 2/5, I'm going to shade from 0 to 2/5. Okay, so let's shade that one so we can see. And then this one is 1/3, so let's shade from 0 to 1/3. And we have our parts divided out about as close as we can get accurately, which students sometimes have difficulty with that, so that's one thing we encourage them to take their time on, is splitting up the equal parts. And so I can see using the number line also that 2/5 is also greater than 1/3 using the number line. So thinking about the benchmark fraction, which again said is harder with those odd denominators, but you can also do visual fraction model. So if I'm going to compare 2/5 and 1/3, I could have students, okay, well, let's draw a visual fraction model for 2/5. Okay, we want to make those boxes the same size. And we'll draw one for 2/3, or for 1/3, my bad. Okay, so this one's going to be 5 equal parts. And this one was going to be 3 equal parts. Okay, so again, I'm going to shade these. So this one was supposed to be 2/5. This one is 1/3. So let me shade 2 out of 5. And let me shade 1/3. And again, I can see that my 2/5 is still slightly greater than my 1/3. Okay, I can see that down through there. Okay, but then there's one little tricky way that I also show students that they can always use to check their work, and I'm really hoping they reserve this method for checking work. But there's something we call the butterfly method. And with the butterfly method, we make wings, and we can say they look like butterflies. And so with this, we have our comparison statement, and we're going to draw wings on our statement. So we're going to crisscross these. And I tell students they have to remember that they multiply what's inside the wing because it looks like an X. We just made an X. So, and I tell them they can make the little antenna for the butterfly. And so we can then multiply what's inside each wing. This wing is 2 and 3, and again the X here represents that we're going to multiply. So 2 times 3 is 6, and this wing, 5 times 1 is 5, and again we see that 6 is greater than 5, therefore 2/5 is greater than 1/3. Just some tricks of the trade, just some things to help students learn to compare the fractions other than just using common denominators. We can think about those benchmark fractions, we can use visual fraction models, and we can always check our work with the butterfly method. And hopefully this has helped you with some ways to help your child with